Thanks for having me. So I guess we'll get started. I want to invite you all, welcome to today's webinar, 5 Ways Volunteering Can Enhance Your Job Search. And I just want to thank CharityVillage, Bmeaningful, and TalentEgg for giving us the opportunity to share this information with you today. So just to introduce you to myself, a little bit about me. So I do work for Volunteer Toronto. I'm a volunteer engagement coordinator with them. And essentially what this means is that I oversee our community outreach initiatives. This means that I oversee a team of volunteers that represents us at career and volunteer fairs across the city. I also oversee a team of volunteers that delivers information sessions like the one that you're going to hear today for job seekers, newcomers, youth, as well as seniors. I'm also the lead on Volunteer Toronto's signature events, mainly the Youth Expo, which is a volunteer fair mainly for high school students, which we host every year in the fall, which, attracts 1,200 youth every year, as well as over 100 nonprofits participating. And finally, I am overseeing our Legacy Awards planning process. The Legacy Awards are an event that happens every year during National Volunteer Week in April, where we recognize 6 exceptional volunteers from across the city. We're actually accepting nominations right now. So if you do know of any unsung heroes who deserve to be recognized for their volunteer work, you can feel free to nominate them on volunteertoronto.ca. I actually come from a global affairs background, and I've done a fair bit of volunteering in my time since high school at various organizations like the Art Gallery of Ontario, Habitat for Humanity, and the Daily Bread Food Bank. And all of these experiences really set me up to fulfill this role as volunteer engagement coordinator. So I know that today we are chatting to people across the country. So many of you may not be familiar with Volunteer Toronto. So I'll just give you a little bit of background information on what we actually do. So our purpose is essentially twofold. So firstly, we engage in helping members of the public find out about volunteering opportunities and really setting them up for success when applying for those opportunities. So we do this through a few different ways. We have a website, as I mentioned, volunteertoronto.ca, where we have a search engine of over 600 opportunities at any given time at nonprofits across the city. So you can search by category for anything from positions related to environment and animals, social service work, whatever it is that you're passionate about. If you aren't really sure where to start, we provide a service called volunteer advising. So you can book an appointment to come into our office. Our office is at Bloor and Christie in Toronto, to chat with one of our volunteer advisors, and they can really walk you through the opportunities available and point you in the right direction. They can also take a look at your application or resume and give you some tips. So you can call or email them with any questions as well, and I've included that contact information on the final slide of this presentation. As I mentioned, we also do info sessions and appear at different events across the city in order to inform people about the opportunities available. Our second main purpose is to provide volunteer managers and coordinators with training and guidance when it comes to volunteer recruitment, screening, retention, and recognition. So if you do choose to volunteer, these are the people who are going to be overseeing your volunteer participation. So we want to make sure that nonprofits are providing a great experience for their volunteers. So let's start off with the basics. What is volunteering? Well, we define volunteering as freely giving your time and service, usually at a nonprofit organization. So of course, the main feature of volunteering is that you won't be getting paid, but there are many other benefits. So what is a nonprofit organization? Well, essentially, a nonprofit organization is one that doesn't exist to make money for its shareholders as a for-profit company would, but rather it exists to serve a particular mission or cause. So whether that's finding a cure for cancer or protecting wildlife, again, you can find an organization working on whatever it is that you're passionate about. So some nonprofits will be larger registered charities. Others may be completely volunteer-run grassroots movements. There's a wide variety. Nonprofits typically have a volunteer board of directors and can have a mix of paid staff and volunteers. So the reason why we clarify that you will be volunteering at a nonprofit if you find that role on volunteertoronto.ca is that these volunteer roles are going to be different than, let's say, an unpaid co-op placement or unpaid internship that you might find at a for-profit company. So just to give you a little bit of context, what you might not know about the volunteer sector. So on average, Canadians contribute 154 volunteer hours each year, and that's being contributed by 17 million Canadians who volunteered at some point in their lives. Volunteer Toronto actually supports 250,000 of these volunteers each year through our various free programs and services. The volunteer sector is actually quite integral to Canadian society, but also the Canadian economy. So it contributes more GDP than the mining, oil and gas, retail, agriculture, and car manufacturing industries combined. So the last time that Statistics Canada actually collected this information, they found that volunteers added over 2 billion unpaid hours to Canada's work efforts in 2013, and that was valued at nearly $56 billion. So, a lot of these nonprofits would not be able to either exist or reach as many people and have the impact that they do have without the help of all of these incredible volunteers. So if you do choose to volunteer, you'll be in great company. All right, so why volunteer? I'm sure many of you are coming to this session with your own ideas of why you would like to volunteer. But whether you're a newcomer to Canada, a recent graduate, maybe you've been out of work for a little while, or you're looking to enter a new field, the job search can sometimes feel a little bit isolating or challenging, but it doesn't have to be this way. Volunteering is, not only a great way to contribute to your community, But you can see from these stats that many Canadians are also aware that it's an incredible way to build transferable skills and experience, network and cultivate references, and hone your job application skills. So volunteering, can also add a lot of structure and meaning to your day. So sometimes job seekers will find themselves sitting behind their computers for days on end, sending applications out, maybe not hearing back. And this can be very isolating and, lead to a loss of confidence and even, sometimes depression. So having a place to go, a regular schedule where your fellow volunteers are looking forward to your contributions can really keep your spirits high during a difficult time. And as you can see here, the majority of Canadians are looking to volunteer to improve their own well-being and health. So volunteering should really be a mutually beneficial experience for both yourself and for the organization and their clients. So I've included a little case study here for you just to inspire you. This is Maya, and she is a great example of someone who used volunteer work to propel their job search. So she came to Canada from Egypt with a background in marketing and communications, and she wanted to apply those skills and that experience. And she actually volunteered with Volunteer Toronto with our marketing communications team, as well as in the role of volunteer advisor. And we're happy to share that she is now working in her field and has built a really strong network through all the people that she met while volunteering. All right, so one of the first questions that we get from people who are looking to volunteer is, what is the time commitment? So how much of my free time am I going to have to give up in order to volunteer? So the best answer to this is really that it is up to you. You want to find a volunteer role that is going to work with your schedule, depending on whether you are currently out of work or whether you are working part-time or full-time. So you can kind of think about volunteers as volunteer positions as falling into one of three categories. So one-day positions are usually things like ushering at a theater festival or helping set up at a marathon. They usually require a less onerous application process. So you may want to consider these positions if you're, looking to have some fun, meet some new people, maybe practice your English if that's one of your goals. And really, just get out there, especially if you are a first-time volunteer and don't have much experience on your resume. But if you are looking to, really use and develop skills, put some great experience on your resume, and gain a strong reference, I would recommend looking more towards the short-term and longer-term volunteer roles. So short-term roles will usually be project-based roles, typically 1 to 3 months. And what this means is that once the project is complete, your volunteer role would also come to an end. So examples would include perhaps helping with a fundraising campaign or a research project where you will be coming into the office of a nonprofit for maybe one morning or afternoon each week until the project is complete. Longer term roles are, again, great if you are looking to build really strong relationships with fellow volunteers and staff members. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you will be volunteering a ton of hours. It just means that you'll be committing to that role for 3 months, usually to a year. So if you are interested in continuing to volunteer once you've found a full-time job, or if you're currently employed, you'll probably want to look for long-term roles where you'll be volunteering in the evening or on the weekends, or even remote positions. All right, so when thinking about how to start your volunteer journey, at Volunteer Toronto, we like to talk about the 3 R's, which are reflect, research, and reach out. So first off, reflect. The reason why we ask people to reflect before they start looking for positions is because you really want to be strategic when it comes to the types of positions that you're applying for, especially as a job seeker. So, you know, location and scheduling are not the only factors that you want to consider. You also want to think about the following questions. So what do I want to gain from volunteering? What skills do I want to use? What issues am I most passionate about? How much time can I commit? And do I want to work alone or with others? So I've listed a few examples of types of volunteer roles here. And, you know, as you can see, in some cases, you may be able to find a volunteer position that perfectly aligns with the paid position you'd ideally like to end up in. However, more often than not, you'll have to think outside the box a little bit. Think about which volunteer positions will allow you to exercise and develop some, if not all, of the key skills you'll need in your professional career. So, for example, if you are hoping to eventually find a job in accounting, you probably won't actually find a volunteer position with the title accountant, but you will find volunteer positions with the title of income tax preparer. This is a really fulfilling volunteer role where you will be helping people in need file their taxes and receive the benefits that they're due from the government. If you are, for example, interested in developing your leadership skills, or you have finance or HR experience, you may want to consider volunteering on a board of directors. And if you are interested in that, Volunteer Toronto actually frequently holds workshops called Becoming a Board Member, where we go over all the tips and tricks when it comes to finding a board position. But you do have to be in Toronto to attend those. You know, another example, if you are, for example, looking to test out a career in healthcare, maybe you want to become a personal support worker or a nurse, but you're not sure if you want to, you know, invest further in education in those areas. You might want to volunteer and just see if it's right for you. So you can volunteer as a recreational program assistant, perhaps in a senior's home where you might be teaching yoga or facilitating a knitting circle. Maybe you want to volunteer as a patient and family care assistant in a children's hospice. So there are a lot of different options. And when you do start to research, just keep an open mind. So once you have, you know, done that reflection, you're going to want to start to research positions to apply to. So the best way to go about this is to find your local volunteer center. There are actually 235 volunteer centers in Canada, And Volunteer Canada actually has a great map on their website, volunteer.ca, where you can find your nearest center. If you're based in Toronto, you can certainly utilize our website, volunteertoronto.ca, or again, you may want to contact one of our volunteer advisors for some assistance. And I just want to give a shout out to CharityVillage.com, where you can also find volunteer positions across Canada. All right, so we're coming to our third R, which is reach out. So what to expect when applying for a volunteer role? Well, first, of course, you're going to have to submit your application. So your volunteer center won't necessarily be able to place you into a volunteer role. You will have to apply, sort of as you would with a paid position. So for one-day events, this will usually take the form of a quick online application form so they can record your availability and role preference. In some cases, you may also simply be asked to express your interest by calling or emailing the volunteer coordinator. For short-term roles or longer-term roles, you may be asked to either fill out a longer online application form or submit a cover letter and resume by email. This is usually the case for higher responsibility roles or higher skilled roles as well. Secondly, depending on the volunteer role, you may also be asked to participate in an interview. Usually for those shorter term roles, this would take the form of a 15-minute phone interview where they will just try to get to know you a little bit better. But for those longer term, higher responsibility roles, this may take the form of a more formal in-person interview at their office. And finally, you may be surprised to find out that you may also be asked to provide references. Typically for volunteer positions, volunteer managers will be a little bit more flexible than a hiring manager might for a paid position. So this means that if you're a newcomer to Canada, you will often be able to provide references from your country of origin, as long as your reference can communicate in the same language as the volunteer coordinator. And often you will also be able to submit academic references or perhaps use your settlement worker or social worker or religious leader as a reference. You just want to make sure that you ask what types of references will be required before going through the whole application process. You may also encounter a few additional requirements. So in Toronto, this would consist of either a vulnerable sector check or a criminal police check. So the vulnerable sector check is applicable to volunteer roles where you will be volunteering with children, with seniors, or with people with disabilities. And this would usually occur after you have been through the interview and they've decided to take you on as a volunteer. So the organization that you're applying to will actually oversee this process. It is $20, but they may be able to reimburse you for that. If you are going to be in a volunteer position where you will be handling money or private information, such as a fundraising role, or will be driving, such as a Meals on Wheels role, you may be asked to provide a criminal police check. This can actually be ordered online or ordered at specified police stations and then picked up. So in both of these cases, the results would come to you, and then it would be up to you whether you want to share them with the nonprofit organization. And this is a typical requirement for everyone who applies to a certain role. So not all roles will require a police check, but if you are asked for one, all the other applicants will be asked for one. And again, I'll just reiterate that this is specific to Toronto. Other municipalities, other police forces will have different names for these or different processes. So you just want to ask the nonprofit what the process is, or inquire or research into it on your police force's website. So at this point in the presentation, I just want to pause for a moment and encourage you not to be discouraged when you are applying to volunteer roles if you don't hear back immediately. So there are a few reasons why you might not hear back immediately. The first one being that many skilled job seekers are aware that volunteering will give them a leg up when it comes to securing a paid position. So there are a lot of highly talented, skilled people applying to these volunteer roles. So there's a little bit more competition than you would think for volunteer roles. The other aspect is that often volunteer coordinators or managers, especially at smaller nonprofits, are really, wearing multiple hats. So they might have a lot on their plate, and so it might just take a little bit of extra time for you to hear back. So, keep applying to volunteer positions until you do get a positive response. Don't just rly on one or two applications. And feel free to follow up politely and just simply inquire about where the volunteer coordinator is in their screening process and if you can expect a response. But as with applying to a job, not all volunteer managers will respond to all applicants. They may only respond to those who they want to move forward with. All right, so now that we've covered how to go about looking for and securing a volunteer position, I'm going to move into what you're all here for, the 5 ways volunteering can actually enhance your job search. So these are skill development, networking, practicing your cover letter and resume writing as well as preparing for interviews, getting feedback, and cultivating references. So the first way is skill development. And transferable skills are really key when you're putting together your resume and prepping for an interview. And as I mentioned, you may not be able to find a volunteer role that perfectly aligns with the paid position you're hoping to get, but you will be able to find a volunteer role where you will be demonstrating and gaining new transferable skills. So we define these as specific skills that you've been using in one way that can be usefully applied to a different task or setting. So a good example of this is Lauren. She has volunteered with RENA Disability Services. And one of her favorite memories over the 2 years that she spent there was teaching a couple of teenagers to actually learn to tie their shoes. So she obviously isn't going to go off into the world and look for a job where she is exclusively teaching people to tie their shoes, but she will be able to speak to transferable skills such as patience, communication, adapting to different learning styles, as well as empathy. which are going to be useful skills in many different positions. So you'll see a list here of various different transferable skills, from conflict resolution to multitasking to time management. Many of these you may already have, and you just haven't maybe sat down and created a list of all of your transferable skills, which isn't a bad idea when you're preparing for a networking event or an interview. And you want to think about examples of when you've demonstrated these transferable skills. So our second way that volunteering can enhance your job search is through networking. So oftentimes when we hear the word networking, it can be a little bit stressful. You know, you may think of some kind of awkward networking event where your goal is to, you know, exchange as many business cards as possible, or maybe add as many people as you can on LinkedIn following the event. But this isn't the only place where networking can occur. So networking can happen anywhere, especially in your volunteer role. And if you think about networking a little bit differently, it can be a little bit more accessible. So we like to define networking as developing relationships with other people, sharing relevant information and resources, and providing mutual support and encouragement on the path to reaching your goals. So when you are volunteering, you're providing your valuable time and effort and skills to an organization. And, you know, organizations are going to be very appreciative of this, and your volunteer manager, as a result, is more likely to support you in your job search than they are to support someone that they met briefly at a networking event. All right, so moving on to the third way that volunteering can help you in your job search, and that is practice. So this is a big one because the process of applying for volunteer positions, as you may have gathered, can be very similar to applying for a job, which is going to allow you to hone your cover letter writing skills, your resume writing skills, and help you prepare for those interviews for paid positions. So let's start off with cover letters. So cover letters are notoriously difficult to write, and that's because it's your first impression. It's your chance to explain to the hiring manager or volunteer coordinator why you're the perfect fit for the role and will add untold value to the organization. You only have one page pretty much to do all of those things. So if you want to stand out from all of the other applicants, you're going to want to share information that grabs the reader's attention by speaking about your unique personality and life experience. So do you even need a cover letter? In this day and age when we're told that often hiring managers don't even read our entire resume, do you still need a cover letter? So the answer to this is yes, especially if you are asked for one. You, of course, want to include one. But even if you're not asked for a cover letter, you may still want to include one, or at least put together a brief introductory email to go along with your resume that lays out your unique background and what you have to offer and why you're interested in whether it's a volunteer role or a paid position. So in order to structure your cover letter, you're going to want to focus on three main areas, and that is your personal story or connection to the cause, number one. And that means that you want to share why you're passionate about the organization's work. Perhaps they're embarking on a project that you're really interested in. Perhaps you yourself or a member of your family or friend group has personally benefited from their services or been affected by the cause that they're trying to raise awareness of, you want to share that. If you are a newcomer to Canada, you want to share a little bit about your personal journey and how that applies to the organization's work. Secondly, you can include any information that doesn't fit in your resume as long as it is tailored to the position. So you may not have room to put any informal volunteering, any traveling, any academic work that you've done in your resume, but you may be able to speak to it in your cover letter. And finally, this is your opportunity to, of course, as I mentioned, make a great first impression. And you want to do that by ensuring that there are no spelling or grammatical errors in your cover letter, especially if the role you're applying to emphasizes that you should have great communication skills. So in order to ensure this, you will probably want to have someone look over your cover letter before you submit it. You can have, a fellow volunteer, a family member, a friend look over it, or you may be able to find an employment center in your area that will provide perhaps free workshops or drop-in services where you can provide them with a draft of your cover letter and they can give you some edits. All right. So let's move on to resumes. So as I said, applying to volunteer roles is really going to allow you to hone your resume writing skills, especially if you do ask for feedback from volunteer managers along the way. So not only does it allow you to figure out what the best resume format for you might be and what you should include or exclude, but volunteering, once you actually do find that incredible volunteer position, you want to make sure to add it to your resume. There are a few reasons for this. So at Volunteer Toronto, we like to say that work is work, whether paid or unpaid. And that means that volunteer work is really valuable experience, even though you aren't getting paid. Especially if it is the most relevant experience that you have, you want to include it. It also allows you to avoid gaps in activity. If you've been out of work for a while and are using a chronological resume, putting your volunteer work on there shows that you're currently actively engaged in your community. Including your volunteer work also allows you to show that you're keeping your skills fresh. And if you are entering a new field, it allows you to highlight that experience if your volunteer work is relevant. And, it just shows you to be a well-rounded candidate because you are engaged and interested in giving back. So if you're starting from scratch, you don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to creating a resume. There are a lot of resume templates available online, and you just want to search for the type that is going to suit you best. So here we've identified a couple types of resumes. So if you're applying to a standard position at a typical traditional company, if you maybe know that the HR department is going to be reviewing your application, and if you have a significant amount of the requested experience, you may want to use a chronological resume. This type of resume is essentially going to list your work history going back no more than 8 to 10 years, and your resume really shouldn't be more than 1 to 2 pages. If you are applying to an entry-level position where you have little experience, or perhaps you have several extended gaps in your chronological work history, or maybe even if you're just applying to a startup with a focus on innovation, you may want to use a functional resume, which is going to highlight your skills and achievements over your experience level. It's also possible to combine the two, so you can always include a selected achievement section before your work experience section. And again, you just want to Google either functional or chronological resume template and model your resume after that. A few tips for including your volunteer experience on your resume. So usually at the top of your resume, you'll have a professional highlights section, and you're going to want to assume that this is the only section that is actually going to be read by the hiring manager. And so you want to make sure that it matches up with the posting. Then under professional experience, you can feel free to list your volunteer experience. You just want to make sure that it is a significant contribution before including it. So typically we recommend that people volunteer 2 to 3 months before listing their volunteer work on their resume. And you just want to be clear that it is a volunteer role. So you can see highlighted here, or circled rather, the word volunteer. Instead of just listing your volunteer duties, you will want to use quantifiable measurements to describe your volunteer work. So instead of saying that, you know, it was your job to develop a networking club, you want to say that you developed a networking club that increased agency membership by 80%. So you really want to give a quantifiable measurement to that achievement. If you don't have a LinkedIn account, I would really recommend that you set one up. This is a great place to actually include any of those shorter term or one-day volunteer roles that maybe you can't include on your resume because it would take up too much valuable space. So you can, as you can see here, under volunteer experience and causes, list as many roles as you want. A few tips for making the most of LinkedIn. So we really recommend that you include a photo. It's going to make your profile more memorable. And that you only connect with people that you actually have met. So you want to make sure that you are connecting with your fellow volunteers, staff members at the organization that you're volunteering at, you know, people that are actually working in your field or the field you hope to get into and that you've actually had at least a brief interaction with. Because building your LinkedIn connections into the hundreds of people that you don't really know isn't going to do a lot to support your job search, because those people won't be able to speak to the value that you're going to bring to an organization. Finally, when it comes to practice, you are going to have the opportunity to practice your interview skills when applying to volunteer roles, especially when applying to those longer term roles. So when it comes to either a volunteer role interview or a paid position interview, you want to make sure that you are preparing in advance for some of those commonly asked questions. So for example, what do you know about our organization? So you want to do your research before the interview. So in addition to taking a look through the organization's website, you might want to look into their latest annual report, look for any media covering the initiatives that they're working on. This will give you insight into their priorities and will show that you are a serious and thoughtful candidate. When it comes to answering the question of why do you want this role, you really want to be authentic and honest about your goals, and you want to show them that you are the best person to help or support them, but you don't want to make it all about you. So you really want to demonstrate how you are going to help them achieve their strategic priorities, their goals, their objectives. And finally, tell us about yourself is a very common question that is asked in interviews. And so we'll delve a little bit deeper into this particular question. So when answering this question, you really want to keep it simple and focused. It can be easy to start rambling, and so you want to prepare in advance. And you'll want to focus on 3 main areas. So number 1, who you are and your current or desired position, your area of expertise, and why you're there interviewing for that position. So I'll give you a little example to demonstrate what I mean. So a good example of tell us about yourself would be, I'm an innovative HR manager, new to Canada, with 8 years of experience managing all aspects of the HR function, from recruiting to benefits. I've spent the last 6 years developing my skills as a customer service manager, where I've won several performance awards and have been promoted twice. I love managing teams and solving customers' problems. I'm interested in adding new and practical experience to my resume, and this position particularly excites me because, and then you'll explain why. So you can see that they are really quantifying their experience, demonstrating their expertise. So when interviewing, you may also come across situational questions, such as tell us about a time when a project did not go according to plan. How did you handle this? So in this case, you'll want to use the STAR model. This stands for situation, task, activity, and result. So I'll give you another example. So we were due to deliver a presentation about a new product to a group of 30 purchasers. Stuart, the lead presenter, got stuck on the subway. So that would be this person's situation. Then they're going to describe the task. It was my responsibility to find an alternative so it didn't reflect badly on the company and we didn't waste the opportunity. They're then going to talk about the activity, what they actually did to resolve the situation. So I spoke to the event organizers to find out if they could change the order of the speakers. They agreed, so we bought ourselves some time. I contacted Susan, another member of the team, who was able to step in. She agreed to drop what she was doing and head to the event. And finally, you're going to describe the result. So you want to make sure that this is a positive outcome that you're describing. For example, Stuart didn't make the meeting on time, but we explained the problem to the delegates, and Susan's presentation went well and was warmly received. Stuart managed to get there for the last 15 minutes to answer questions. As a result, we gained some good contacts, at least 2 of which we converted into paying clients. So, the interview went great. You're feeling confident about your chances. The next step is to send a follow-up email, usually within 48 hours. You want to keep it brief and professional, but you can include any need-to-know information that you forgot to mention in the interview, as long as it's extremely relevant to the position and you feel that they really need to know about it. You can also consider sending a LinkedIn request, but you may want to save that until you're a little more established in the industry if you don't feel comfortable doing that right away. So moving on to the fourth way that volunteering can enhance your job search, and that is getting feedback. So as I mentioned, volunteer positions can be a little bit competitive, so you may not get every volunteer role that you apply to. And if you don't get a position, make sure to ask why. Very few people actually do this, and so, it may help you stand out as well, and that volunteer manager may keep you in mind for future positions, especially if you show improvement. So you want to ask them, is there anything I can do to improve my cover letter, my resume, my interview skills, and then use that feedback to adapt future applications. Even if you do, secure that great volunteer role, you want to make sure to ask feedback after you've been in the role for a few weeks, just to gain insight into your performance. You don't just want to ask about, areas of improvement. You can also ask about what you're doing well, and that'll allow you to build confidence and, articulate your strengths in a future interview. And finally, cultivating great references is our last way that volunteering can enhance your job search. So I know that a lot of people are looking for a reference out of their volunteer position. And in order to get a great reference, you're really going to want to treat your volunteer role with the same gravity that you would a paid position. So this means that you're going to want to be on time for your volunteer shift, be punctual, be responsive to emails or calls from the volunteer manager. And you want to make sure to communicate any issues that may affect your volunteer duties. You also want to make sure to accept any guidance that they provide and be willing and eager to participate in training or orientation. As well, if there's anything that you don't feel comfortable with or you believe that you would benefit from further learning opportunities, you want to communicate that with your supervisor. And finally, you just want to make sure that you are doing your best to complete the duties as assigned and directed. And what helps with this is to come prepared for the role. So be informed about the role of paid staff and other volunteers at the organization, maintain a smooth working relationship with them, and try to stay within the bounds of your volunteer role. If you want to take on further responsibilities, that's something you want to discuss first with your supervisor. You want to make sure that you are following the policies and procedures of the organization. So if they have an anti-harassment and discrimination policy or a confidentiality policy, you want to read through those and make sure that you're abiding by them. So I've talked a lot about the demands of the volunteer search and volunteering itself, but when you're volunteering, you are, of course, giving up your valuable free time, so you want to make sure that you enjoy and benefit from the role. So the best way to ensure this is to ask a lot of questions before you commit to the role. So usually at the end of an interview, the interviewer will ask if you have any questions for them, and so you probably want to prepare in advance a few questions about the volunteering environment, what kind of training you're going to receive, be clear on the time commitment that is going to be required, and make sure that you can fulfill it. When you know what to expect, the volunteer role is going to be a lot more fulfilling and beneficial when it comes to your job search. So even if you do know what to expect and you're volunteering in the role for a little while and you kind of change your mind, or you find that it's not as beneficial as you thought it would be, you want to ask your volunteer manager if there's any accommodations that they can make to the role, or perhaps there's another role at that same nonprofit that would be a better fit for you. So change is okay. If there's nothing that your manager can do to improve the situation, you are certainly free to leave that volunteer role and pursue a different position. What you just want to make sure that you do is give them 1 to 2 weeks notice, as you would in a paid position, so that they can find another volunteer to fill your spot, and so that you don't burn any bridges with them. So even if you do say at the beginning of your volunteer role that you're willing to commit for 3 months, that doesn't mean that you are tied to that volunteer role because you haven't signed a contract with them. It's basically a good faith agreement. All right, so that's all for me. I'm happy to take any questions that any of you have. Again, I've included the contact information for our volunteer advisors here on the screen. So if you have any questions after the presentation, feel free to give us a call or shoot us an email. And with that, I will pass it back to Marina to see if we have any questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Olivia. It's been a wonderful presentation, and I see that we are coming up on time here. So we will go over and take some questions, but for those of you that need to leave now, rest assured we'll record the Q&A as well, and you'll get the full recording by email later today, so you can watch that at your convenience. So Olivia, let's jump right in. We've had a couple of questions come up related to accepting volunteer positions while you're still job searching. A lot of times, you need to commit maybe to a particular shift or a particular length of time, but folks are wondering, how do you juggle that if you then get a job that conflicts with what you've committed to in the volunteer role?
Okay. Yeah, so what I would recommend in that situation is that, first of all, you want to be upfront with the person who is recruiting you. If it's the volunteer coordinator, you want to be upfront with them that you are a job seeker and you are hoping to secure a full-time position if it is a 9-to-5 position that you are volunteering in. So in my own experience, as a job seeker, I was volunteering 9 to 5, around 4 days a week, and it managed to work out because I did end up finding a paid full-time role after 3 months of volunteering. So it lined up. I know it won't line up for everyone, but typically, volunteer managers are still open to taking you on as a volunteer, even if they know that you are going to be accepting a paid position that is going to conflict with your volunteer shifts. You may be able to transition into another volunteer role that would be evening or weekend based, or perhaps remote. Or maybe, you can continue to volunteer with them at some of their events that are held on the weekend. So you want to just express to them that you'd be happy to participate in any way that your schedule will allow. If you expect to secure a full-time position in a few weeks rather than a few months, I would recommend starting off by looking at those evening and weekend positions or remote positions, as well as the shorter term positions which maybe you only be volunteering for a couple of weeks for.
That's excellent. Great. Now, is it possible to get any kind of certification after volunteering?
Yeah, so usually it wouldn't be framed as a certification. It would more so be a letter which would confirm your volunteer hours. So, you know, sometimes nonprofits will have a policy where they may only provide a reference letter after you volunteered for a certain number of months or hours, but they may still be able to provide you with a letter just simply indicating how many hours you volunteered so far, even if they aren't able to provide a more in-depth reference letter speaking to your performance. So not so much a certification, but definitely proof of hours volunteered.
Excellent. And we had someone asking how they might be able to volunteer to get legal experience. And I know that that can be a common question with certain industries that might also include banking or policing. Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, for sure. So certain types of paid positions may not have a direct, directly adjacent volunteer roles, such as banker, lawyer, police officer, but you can definitely find volunteer roles that will cover some of the same territory and will also allow you to network with people in those fields. So I would say if you are looking for legal experience, you might want to, first of all, do a little research into what types of nonprofits are working on, criminal justice reform, or perhaps like legal hotlines for members of the public, and see if you can get involved with those organizations. You may also want to, again, look at those board or committee opportunities because there often are individuals with legal backgrounds serving on boards and advising nonprofits on legal issues. And so that's a great way to network with people who may have some expertise in that area and may be able to connect you with other people in the legal profession.
Those are wonderful tips. Okay, and for someone who's new to Canada, how do you recommend them getting some references to use when applying for a volunteer position?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, if you are new to Canada, don't be afraid to use your international references as long as they can communicate in the language of the hiring manager or volunteer manager. Usually English or French, but it depends. A lot of nonprofits in the city are actually looking for people who speak languages other than the two official languages. So if you don't have any references, professional references from Canada, volunteering is a great way to gain a reference. You want to make sure that you are looking for those longer term positions so that you can build relationships with people, particularly your direct supervisor. And then after you've been volunteering for a few months, simply let them know that you are applying to some paid positions, and you would really appreciate if they would serve as a reference for you, and typically they will be happy to do so. But again, also, if you do require a reference for either a volunteer or a paid position, you just want to inquire as to what types of references are allowed, because there may be more flexibility than you think. You may be able to use your settlement worker, for example, as a reference. So you just want to keep that in mind.
That's very helpful, Olivia. And I think this will be our final question for today. Now, we obviously discussed that volunteer work isn't paid, but sometimes there might be incentives or honorariums offered. Are there any rules around that or anything that people should watch for?
So it's quite rare that you will receive an honorarium, but typically it's not an issue. I would say the only situation you want to be careful with is if you are doing work that is typically done by a paid employee, especially if you do not have a work permit. But commonly, nonprofit organizations will, as opposed to offering honorariums, they will cover the costs of transportation, they will cover the costs of your police check. So, you won't actually have to spend any money in order to volunteer. But in terms of, any restrictions when it comes to honorariums, if you are worried about that, I would, definitely recommend raising that concern with the volunteer manager. And, if you are a newcomer to Canada and you don't have a work permit, you could still volunteer, of course, but when it comes to, honorariums, you may just want to contact, your settlement worker and ask about any restrictions around that.
Oh, that's great. Well, I think we're going to close things there. So thank you so much, Olivia. It's been a wonderful presentation. Did you have any last comments before we sign off?
I think I've said, everything that I came to say, but again, Volunteer Toronto, we're here to help, especially if you either live or want to volunteer in Toronto. And I wish you all the best of luck, everyone who's participated, and I'm sure you'll all find wonderfully fulfilling volunteer roles. So good luck.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Before we sign off, I just want to remind everyone that we are going to follow up with you by email this afternoon with the webinar recording and the slide deck. We'll also include a short survey for you. It takes less than 5 minutes to fill out, and we hope that you'll complete that for us. You'll have an opportunity there to let us know if there's other topics you'd like to see covered in a future session, and we'll also be sure to share the feedback with Olivia as well. On behalf of CharityVillage, TalentEgg, and Bmeaningful, thank you so much for joining us today. At CharityVillage, we do host dozens of free webinars every year, and we hope that we'll see you at more of our sessions this year. Our next free webinar will be held on February 13th and is going to be a discussion about how empathy is a key ingredient in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the nonprofit sector. We will include a link to that in the email that we send later today, just in case you'd like to register. With that, I'd like to say thanks again for taking part in today's webinar. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.